It's the first week in March of 2021 here in Horry County. And I can't really say the weather in the last several weeks has been that good. In fact, in February, we had 2 to 3 weeks of continuous rain. Many people thought that they'd never see the sun again. We had so much rain. And as a result of all that rain, once again, the Waccamaw River is up into flood stage. Now, not all floods are the same. The one that we're having right now in 2021 is relatively minor. I think the Waccamaw River got up to about 15 feet. We can, of course, contrast that with what I call the Great Conway flood that occurred back in 2018, where the river got up to 21 feet. Nevertheless, we're in a good, healthy flood. And what I want to do is to go out in the field, go around and take some footage of some of the places where flooding impacts can be seen. And then I want to end up back over in Conway and revisit some of the places that were flooded so badly back in 2018, just to see how things have changed. So when you get down near some of these blackwater rivers, you start to see some really interesting things. Here's an interesting one right here. Walking along a little road right here. Water on this side. There's the little road almost flooded. Water on that side, and obviously there's a drainage culvert underneath the road, because you see the neat little whirlpool right there, where the water's literally whirlpooling down, going somewhere, and where it's going is right over here, going under the road, bubbling up over here, and heading on down the river. So here we are. We're down the road a little ways from where I live. This is the Waccamaw River. Kind of funny here because I'll show you in a second a place where I usually drive down to put my boat in the water. And as I pan around, you'll see that the place where I usually put my boat in the water is nowhere to be seen. And so there's the road that I usually turn in. And as you can see, there's where the parking lot used to be. It's well underwater, water flowing like crazy. And if you look off in the distance, there's the dock where I usually put the boat in. And I'd say that area right there is under about, 7, 8, 9 feet of water. The kind of flooding you have to worry about around here is not what you think when you think about a flood. Many people think a flood is when it rains and the water comes up. Nope, not like that. Around here, it's a slow creeping type of flood. The water just continues to run into the rivers, and the rivers slowly rise, and the water keeps rising, and pretty soon you look out your door and there's water in your yard and on the road in front of your house. And if you're lucky, it stops rising and then goes back down. If you're not, it just keeps rising. It's the subdivisions where people don't even know that their backyard or their house is connected to a major river or swamp where the problems occur. Looks perfectly dry during the summer when they first look at the house. Giant rain comes and suddenly the water starts creeping up and up and up and up and continues to creep after the rain has stopped falling, and suddenly water everywhere. That's what you need to be careful about. I'm going to continue talking a little bit about how things flood in coastal areas. This is a little road a little ways down from where I live. Had a lot of rain the last few days, and the rivers are rising. Not raining right now, of course. It hasn't rained for about 3 days, but the water's still rising, and what we see here might look just like a simple ditch with some water, but it's actually a little more interesting than that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pan from this ditch on the right side of the road to the swamp over here on the left side of the road. And if you look out here in the swamp, what I think you can see is the swamp is filled with water. And so if we walk a little bit further down this road, we're going to see exactly what's going on here with the rising water. This actually, on this road right here, is the lowest point on the road. Water's getting a little deeper in the ditch, a little bit deeper still. And if you look on down there a ways, it seems to dwindle away. Right about here, it looks like something interesting is happening. And once again, we see a situation where the road has a culvert underneath it. The culvert goes under here, connects over to here. And this is a ditch that's been dug down through that swamp. And of course, what's happened is the water has risen and it's backed up into this ditch, backed up under the road, and then backed up into the ditch over here. And if this water had continued to rise, it would have just kept rising and rising and rising, and eventually probably flooded that house right there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk over here, and I'm going to try to jump over the water and give you a little bit of a view of what it looks like back in this swamp. And if you look back up in there, as far as you can see, probably a foot or two of water. This particular swamp is connected to another swamp, which is connected to another swamp, which is connected to the Waccamaw River. And that water that we saw in the Waccamaw River yesterday, all connected to this swamp. Waccamaw River rises, the water spills into the swamps and slowly rises. Now, if you look close, what we can see, if you see that tree right over there, you can actually see that the water's starting to come down a little bit. I see about 2 inches of wet wood above the water, which means the water's starting to drop. This is about 4 days after a rain event. Now you really do have to be careful walking around the peripheries of these swamps when the water's rising, because what happens, a lot of the snakes are pushed up out of the swamps and they tend to occupy these little raised areas just like the one I'm standing on. So if you choose to go swamp walking in coastal South Carolina, keep your eyes out for snakes. We're going to go now to an area, the city of Conway, where houses were built in an area that is now flooding quite frequently, and you'll see some of the effects when houses are constructed in some of these flood zones. Here we are over here on the north side of Conway. This is an area that is flooded repeatedly in the past. Really bad flood occurred here a couple years ago, and once again we see it flooding. This one's not so bad, but the road's closed, and as we pan around here, we'll see a house that this time again is flooded. Flooded in the last flood, it'll probably flood again in the future. The one thing that seems to be okay with these floods is this little egret walking around in the floodwaters right here. Now, of course, one of the engineering solutions to flooding in a place like Conway, South Carolina, is to build drainage ditches. And here we see a drainage ditch that cuts right through the middle of this neighborhood, the same neighborhood that flooded. And drainage ditches are a pretty good solution to get the water out. The problem, of course, in these coastal floods is when the rivers start to back up and rise, the same drainage ditches that drain water out serve to bring water in. And so what typically happens when the river waters start to rise is that the water starts to simply rise in these drainage ditches, and in some cases spills over the edges and flows into the yards and the homes. Kind of heartbreaking what we're going to see here in just a few seconds. This whole neighborhood on the north side of Conway flooded really bad a couple years ago, and guess what? It happened again. I remember walking over here and all of this area was way underwater a couple years ago. This latest flood is not as bad, but nevertheless, you can see that it is still pretty bad. A lot of these houses here were abandoned. Some of them were raised up. And some of them just cleaned up, came back, and resumed business as usual. This is pretty typical as far as flooding around here is concerned. This house right here in particular flooded badly during the last big flood. Water kind of stacked up all over the place, and this church that we're going to go by really flooded badly, and they did a lot of renovations to sort of raise things up and replace things, and it looks like they escaped the latest flood, luckily. A lot of the people who flooded in this particular neighborhood decided to raise their house up on stilts. Here's an example of one that looks like it's raised up about 6 feet. And as far as this latest flood is concerned, that appeared to be enough. You can see the water creeping up in the back. We're going to drive through this neighborhood now and look at some of the houses that were flooded a couple years ago. Right here on this corner where this blank lot is, looks kind of dry. That house was torn down as a result of flooding. And this little house here on the corner, it was flooded. It looks like the people rebuilt and continued to live there. The problem in this little house was it's down in a little bowl, and so when the floodwaters rose, that's what happened. And we see right here on the edge, they're trying to improve the drainage a little bit. Don't know whether that'll do the trick. It's important to remember that when we talk about flooding, and as far as these wetland ecosystems are concerned that occur next to these coastal rivers, flooding is supposed to happen to these systems. It's called the flood pulse, and all the organisms that live in these lowland swamps are adapted to periodic and sometimes frequent flooding. The waters rise, the waters fall, and to a certain extent, flooding is necessary to maintain the health of these lowland swamps. The problem occurs when people build houses in these flood zones, and that's where we have a clash between what humans are trying to do and what nature is trying to do.